The elderly man stood quietly at the edge of the sprawling military cemetery, a lone figure dressed in a simple black suit amid a sea of polished uniforms and gleaming medals. The crowd of dignitaries and officials gathered to honor the fallen general paid him no mind, their conversations and solemn rituals unfolding as if he were invisible. Positioned far from the center of attention, he watched the ceremony unfold with a stillness that spoke of decades of unspoken sacrifices. A man who didn't belong, or so it seemed. No one approached him. No hand was extended, no word exchanged. The whispers and quiet salutes of those around him never reached his ears. Yet, behind those calm eyes lay a story that rivaled the very legacy being honored. The crowd's neglect wasn't out of malice, but simple unawareness of the deep connection this forgotten figure held to the ceremony's hero. Then, as the honor guard carefully folded the stars and stripes with practiced precision, everything changed. From the VIP section, a young army colonel broke ranks and strode purposefully toward the elderly man. All eyes turned, breaths caught, as the general's son closed the distance. Without hesitation, he came to attention and offered a crisp, respectful salute, a gesture that echoed through the hearts of everyone present. What happened next would reveal a truth more profound than any medal or ceremony, that sometimes the greatest honor lies not in the spotlight, but in the quiet recognition between those who truly understand sacrifice. Welcome to Echoes of Honor, where we discover that the most important people are often the ones others choose to ignore. Before we continue this powerful story about recognition, gratitude, and the bonds that transcend military rank, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe these stories about honoring those who shaped our leaders deserve to be shared, please hit that subscribe button to join our growing community. Your support helps us recognize the unsung heroes among us. Arlington National Cemetery was shrouded in the solemn dignity that characterized the final resting place of America's heroes on a gray November afternoon, when hundreds of mourners gathered to honor the life and service of General Robert Mitchell, whose death had ended a distinguished military career that spanned 4 decades and multiple conflicts. The funeral represented not only personal loss for family and friends, but also the conclusion of a leadership legacy that had influenced military doctrine and shaped the careers of countless officers throughout the armed forces. The cemetery's hallowed grounds provided an appropriately reverent setting for honoring someone whose service had earned him recognition at the highest levels of military and government leadership. The gathering included senior military officials, government dignitaries, fellow general officers, and family members whose presence reflected both personal relationships and professional respect for someone whose contributions to national defense had been substantial and lasting. The funeral arrangements reflected General Mitchell's status within the military community, with full honors, honor guard participation, and ceremonial elements that recognized his rank and the significance of his service to the nation. The guest list had been carefully compiled to include those whose relationships to the general warranted their presence at such an important occasion. Among the distinguished attendees were active duty generals whose own careers had been influenced by General Mitchell's leadership, retired officers who had served under his command during various assignments, government officials who had worked with him on policy development, and military families whose connections to the general had been forged through shared service and mutual respect. The VIP seating area near the gravesite accommodated immediate family members, senior military officials, and other distinguished guests whose presence honored the general's memory while providing appropriate recognition for his contributions to military service and national defense. The arrangement ensured that those with the closest relationships to the deceased occupied positions that reflected their importance to the ceremony. But at the outer edge of the gathering, standing alone among the headstones that marked other heroes' final resting places, was a figure who seemed disconnected from the official mourners and whose presence appeared more accidental than intentional. Retired Sergeant First Class William Bill Torres, though none of the dignitaries recognized his significance, had traveled from his home in rural Texas to pay his respects to someone who had fundamentally changed the trajectory of his life decades earlier. At 74, Bill moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been shaped by military service and whose bearing still reflected the discipline and attention to detail that had characterized his approach to duty throughout his career. His simple black suit, though clean and pressed, marked him as someone outside the sophisticated social circles that comprised the majority of funeral attendees. Bill's position at the edge of the gathering wasn't chosen out of disrespect or lack of interest in the ceremony, but reflected his understanding that military funerals involved hierarchies and protocols that placed family members and senior officials in positions of prominence, while others observed from appropriate distances. His intention was to pay his respects without interfering with official proceedings or drawing attention to himself. What the distinguished mourners couldn't see, what their focus on official relationships and contemporary military connections prevented them from understanding, was that Bill's presence at the funeral represented one of the most meaningful tributes that could be paid to General Mitchell's memory and his impact on individual lives. The relationship between Bill and General Mitchell had begun 37 years earlier when then-Captain Mitchell had been assigned as a company commander responsible for a unit that included Private Torres, a young soldier whose potential was not immediately obvious to most of his supervisors, but whose character and determination had caught the attention of an officer who understood that leadership involved recognizing and developing capability in unexpected places. Bill's decision to attend General Mitchell's funeral had required sacrifices that he hadn't discussed with anyone and wasn't likely to mention to the distinguished mourners who might wonder about his presence at such an exclusive gathering. The trip from Texas had cost him wages from work he couldn't afford to miss, but witnessing the ceremony had seemed essential to honoring someone whose influence on his life had been profound and lasting. The challenge of attending the funeral without seeming out of place required careful attention to protocol and positioning that would allow him to observe the ceremony without interfering with official proceedings or attracting unwanted attention from organizers who might question his credentials for attending such a distinguished gathering. Bill's knowledge of military funerals and cemetery protocol helped him position himself where he could witness the ceremony while maintaining appropriate distance from VIP seating areas and official participants whose relationships to the general warranted their prominent placement. His understanding of military hierarchy guided his choice to remain at the periphery rather than attempting to claim recognition that might seem inappropriate given his enlisted rank and the passage of time since his direct service under General Mitchell's command. The irony of Bill's position at the edge of the gathering was that his relationship to General Mitchell was more personal and transformative than many of the official connections that had earned other attendees prominent seating and recognition. His exclusion from the inner circle of mourners reflected administrative oversight rather than any lack of qualification for honoring someone whose mentorship had fundamentally shaped his life. As the funeral ceremony progressed through its formal sequence of military honors, Bill observed with the kind of professional attention that characterized his approach to all military ceremonies. His evaluation of the honor guard's performance, the precision of ceremonial movements, and the dignity of the proceedings reflected continuing respect for military traditions and understanding of their significance in honoring distinguished service. The distinguished mourners around him included generals whose careers had been advanced through association with General Mitchell, politicians whose policies had been influenced by his strategic thinking, and military families whose social standing had been enhanced by their connections to such a prominent military leader. Their presence at the funeral reflected official relationships and contemporary military connections rather than the kind of personal transformation that had characterized Bill's experience with the general. But Bill's careful observation of the ceremony was interrupted when he noticed movement in the VIP seating area that suggested something significant was happening among the general's immediate family members. Colonel David Mitchell, the general's son and a distinguished officer in his own right, was scanning the funeral gathering with obvious purpose, as if searching for someone whose presence was important to him. The breakthrough in Bill's anonymity came when Colonel Mitchell's eyes found him among the crowd of mourners, and recognition dawned with startling clarity. Despite the passage of decades and the changes that age had brought to Bill's appearance, the colonel identified the man whose story he had heard countless times throughout his childhood and whose influence on his father's approach to leadership had been mentioned in family conversations for as long as he could remember. Colonel Mitchell's recognition of Bill created an immediate decision point about whether to acknowledge someone whose presence at the funeral honored his father's memory in ways that official mourners couldn't match. despite the potential disruption his gesture might cause to the ceremony's formal proceedings. Colonel Mitchell's decision to leave the VIP seating area during his father's funeral created immediate confusion among family members and concern among ceremony organizers who wondered what had prompted such unprecedented action from the general's son during the most solemn moments of the service. But Colonel Mitchell's movement across the cemetery grounds toward Bill's position at the edge of the gathering was driven by understanding that had been shaped by decades of hearing his father describe the most important leadership lesson of his military career. The recognition that authentic leadership required seeing potential in unexpected places and taking personal responsibility for developing that potential regardless of conventional expectations. The story of Private Torres had been central to General Mitchell's philosophy of leadership and his approach to developing junior personnel throughout his career. Colonel Mitchell had heard the account countless times, how his father had recognized something in a young enlisted soldier that other officers had missed, how he had invested personal time and attention in mentoring someone whose background and circumstances suggested limited potential, and how that investment had transformed not only the soldier's life, but also the general's understanding of what military leadership could accomplish. Sergeant Torres, Colonel Mitchell called out as he approached Bill's position, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery and immediately attracting attention from mourners who were surprised to see the general's son abandoning his place among family members to address someone at the edge of the gathering. Bill's response to being recognized and addressed by Colonel Mitchell reflected both his surprise at being identified after so many years and his understanding that the colonel's gesture honored not only his relationship to the general, but also the leadership principles that had guided the general's entire career. "Colonel Mitchell, sir," Bill replied, his voice carrying the respect and gratitude that had characterized his feelings about the general throughout the decades since their paths had diverged. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was the finest officer I ever served under." But Colonel Mitchell's response went far beyond casual acknowledgement of Bill's attendance at the funeral. Without regard for the attention his action was attracting from hundreds of distinguished mourners, the colonel came to attention and rendered a crisp military salute that honored not only Bill's service, but also his role in shaping the leadership philosophy that had guided General Mitchell throughout his career. The salute from Colonel Mitchell to Bill created one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the funeral's proceedings, demonstrating the kind of respect and recognition that transcended military rank and honored the relationships that had shaped the general's approach to leadership and mentorship. "Sergeant Torres, my father talked about you throughout his entire career," Colonel Mitchell announced, his words carrying clearly across the cemetery and providing context for mourners who were witnessing something they didn't understand but could recognize as significant. "He said you taught him what real leadership meant by showing him that potential exists in places where most people never think to look." The colonel's public recognition of Bill's significance transformed him from an anonymous mourner at the edge of the gathering into someone whose presence honored the general's memory in ways that official attendees couldn't match. The acknowledgement elevated Bill's attendance from personal tribute to validation of leadership principles that had defined the general's approach to military service. The distinguished mourners who had been ignoring Bill's presence now found themselves witnessing a demonstration of authentic military values that connected the general's legacy to specific individuals whose lives had been transformed by his leadership and whose own success had validated his approach to developing personnel. The recognition ceremony that had spontaneously developed during General Mitchell's funeral became a powerful demonstration of the lasting impact that authentic military leadership could have on individual lives and the importance of acknowledging the relationships that had shaped distinguished military careers. Colonel Mitchell's salute to Bill had created an opportunity for other mourners to understand that the general's legacy extended beyond strategic accomplishments and administrative achievements to include personal investments in individual development that had transformed lives and validated leadership principles. "My father always said that his most important military accomplishment wasn't any promotion or award he received, but the moment when he realized that Sergeant Torres had become the kind of leader who could inspire others the same way he had been inspired," Colonel Mitchell continued, his explanation educating the audience about leadership values that had guided the general's entire career. The spontaneous applause that emerged from the funeral gathering reflected mourners' understanding that they were witnessing something that honored both the general's memory and the leadership principles that had made his service meaningful beyond official recognition and ceremonial tribute. Bill's presence at the funeral was revealed to represent not just personal gratitude, but validation of mentorship relationships that had shaped military careers and demonstrated the lasting impact that authentic leadership could have on individual lives and organizational culture. The general's widow, Margaret Mitchell, approached Bill after the ceremony to express her gratitude for his attendance and to share memories of how often her husband had mentioned the leadership lessons he had learned through his relationship with the young soldier who had taught him about potential and possibility. "Bill, Robert talked about you constantly throughout our marriage," Margaret said, her words providing personal context that helped Bill understand how profoundly his relationship with the general had influenced not only military leadership, but also family conversations and personal values. The VIP seating area that had initially seemed inappropriate for Bill was revealed to have been incomplete without his presence, as his attendance provided connection to the general's most important leadership experiences and the relationships that had shaped his approach to developing others throughout his career. The distinguished military officials who attended the funeral gained understanding of leadership principles that extended beyond formal training and official doctrine to include personal relationships and individual mentorship that had shaped the general's approach to command and development of subordinate personnel. The ceremony's chaplain incorporated Colonel Mitchell's recognition of Bill into his closing remarks, using their relationship to illustrate themes about service, mentorship, and the lasting impact that authentic leadership could have on individual lives and military culture. The Honor Guard's presentation of the folded American flag to the general's family took on additional meaning with Bill's presence acknowledged, as the ceremony honored not only official service, but also the personal relationships and individual development that had made that service meaningful and transformative. In the weeks following the funeral, Bill received invitations to participate in leadership development programs and mentorship initiatives that sought to preserve and apply the general's approach to recognizing and developing potential in unexpected places. The cemetery grounds that had witnessed Bill's initial anonymity became the setting for one of the most meaningful demonstrations of military respect and recognition in recent memory, showing that authentic tribute sometimes requires challenging conventional expectations about who deserves honor and acknowledgement. Colonel Mitchell's decision to salute Bill had demonstrated that true military bearing includes the courage to recognize relationships that transcend rank and protocol, and the wisdom to honor the people whose influence had shaped distinguished military careers. The funeral that had begun with Bill's isolation at the edge of the gathering became a celebration of leadership principles that connected individual mentorship to broader military values and demonstrated the lasting impact that authentic development relationships could have on organizational culture. The simple black suit that had marked Bill as different from the distinguished mourners was revealed to represent the kind of authentic character and humble service that had impressed General Mitchell and had validated his belief that leadership potential existed in unexpected places. The position at the edge of the gathering that had seemed appropriate for someone without official connections was transformed into recognition that authentic tribute sometimes comes from those whose relationships to the deceased were more personal and transformative than official associations based on rank or position. Sometimes the most important mourners at military funerals are those who stand at the edges of the gathering, carrying memories of personal transformation and leadership development that honor the deceased more meaningfully than official recognition or ceremonial tribute. Bill Torres had traveled across the country to honor someone whose mentorship had changed his life, but Colonel Mitchell's recognition had ensured that the general's most important leadership legacy was acknowledged and celebrated rather than overlooked among the official tributes and ceremonial honors. The salute that had elevated Bill from anonymous mourner to honored guest had demonstrated that authentic military values include the recognition that distinguished service is often measured by the lives that are changed rather than the positions that are achieved or the ceremonies that are conducted. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose mentorship transformed your life, but who might have been overlooked at gatherings honoring their achievements? Tell us in the comments about the leaders in your life who saw potential where others saw limitations, and how their belief in you changed your understanding of what was possible. And if you think stories like these about honoring the mentors who shaped our lives deserve to be shared, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.